Starting at 5th place on my list, The Legend of Zelda The Minish Cap, originally released in 2004 to great reception across both fans and critics alike. However, its legacy has seemed to diminish as time goes on, unfortunately no doubt due to the 3D Zelda games being a more exciting talking point than its 2D brethren, which I thought was a shame. So as a result this year, I spent some time going back through and playing some 2D Zelda games that I'd also previously skimmed over to focus on the 3D titles. And so because of that, I've now got both Zelda Oracle games under my belt, which while they were great in their own right, they were definitely held back a bit by their hardware, as well as featuring a few simply forgettable dungeons. Fortunately for Flagship, developers of the previous two Oracle games, they would receive a lot more assistance from the greater part of Capcom and Nintendo themselves to create a brand new experience for the Game Boy Advance. This was accomplished by combining the prior strengths of A Link to the Past on top of a new gimmick in which Link is now able to miniaturize himself to allow for greater puzzle depth and exploration, with the side-changing gimmick itself really giving the Minish Cap a unique identity of its own. Land of Hyrule in this game, while on the generic side of things visually, is still deeply rich of secrets all over. As always, you still have returning collectibles like heart pieces and capacity upgrades, however filled across the Minish Cap are new kinstones, which you can trade with NPCs to make new parts of the world itself expand further. That, and the addition of a new item Link obtains in this game called the Mole Mitts, Link can also burrow into walls and find even more items, making overall progression even more dense. I also don't want to undermine the dungeons here either. The main 4 dungeons are still great and surprisingly atmospheric for GBA standards, coupled with top tier 2D Zelda dungeon design. Areas like the Palace of Winds, for example, taking vertical progression as the primary focus as you hop between large chasms and clouds to reach the highest point in the sky above is just an awesome concept and is executed really well here too. Even heart pieces are inside dungeons now in this game, making dungeon exploration more dense than ever before in Zelda. For as good as the game is though, it does have a pretty disappointing set of items for Link to use this time. The problem, I should stress, mainly comes in the form of the amount of items being quite low. A few cool concepts for items aren't even used for mandatory puzzles either, like the boomerang and the remote bomb, while others like the gust chart aren't even that much fun to use. On the plus side, however, this game did bring back the Rocks Cave from the Oracle games, and that item is incredible and really fun to use in this game with some momentum, but still, it's definitely on the weaker side of the spectrum when compared to Link's item arsenals from other games. Overall though, this game does meet the strong expectation of quality you would expect for a 2D Zelda while still bringing plenty of surprises of its own, which I admire a lot in making a sequel, and that's really why it's ranked here despite still being a pretty simple game through and through. Now this game had a lot of challenges it needed to overcome. HAL Laboratories finally took up the mantle of a 3D Kirby game, and now that it's here at last, I'd say they nailed the formula, even if I have a few nitpicks about the execution, which I'll get into in a bit. Before that though, the very first thing I want to give attention to is the graphics here actually. The Switch often does get a bad rep for being underpowered, and some games released on this platform look pretty rank to say the least, but oddly enough, Kirby for the longest time has been a pretty decent graphical showcase for a lot of Nintendo's consoles. Though, it also does help that Kirby games typically release near the end of a system's lifespan. Regardless though, this game looks vibrant, detailed, and is packed with spectacle when it calls for it, all while maintaining a pretty consistent 30 FPS, only dipping on rare occasions. It may not be 60, but I don't have much else to complain in this department. This next area I want to focus on should come as no shock for Kirby, but the bosses are really good in this game. There was zero trouble adapting 2D Kirby bosses to 3D, whether you go with copy abilities or not. I mean, they are still all on the easy side because it's Kirby after all, but they've all got their very own shtick that makes them stand out from each other that encourage different approaches in order to win most effectively with the current ability, which I think in 3D feels even more significant than in prior games. That said, I honestly think even with all these brand new bosses, my favorite bosses just have to be King Dedede's and Meta Knight's Coliseum fight. The music is already enough to sell me on that thought, but the way the fights escalate is just so cool. King Dedede halfway through just throws his hammer out and rips a giant stone pole for far greater reach and power. Then in the rematch, he just throws all weapon options out the window and just turns into an unrelenting beast. Meta Knight, as always, is a classic sword fight, however halfway through, he takes the fight to the sky. It's at this point you engage in a quick time event segment where when successful, you can literally just steal his sword and get the Meta Knight ability. This fight is just so damn awesome. Some of my new favorite fights in the whole series for sure. Now for the overall gameplay loop, levels in this game are dense with secrets and special collectibles to find like Wild D's, which you'll need a certain amount of for each level in order to progress. This allows each level to be more detailed in addition to new gimmicks like in Mouthful Mode, making everything just more memorable this time around. And Mouthful Mode itself is basically just a fancy copy ability where you take the form of an inanimate object and do some pretty funny things. Shooting destructive cans as a vending machine, becoming a car, transforming into just a flight of stairs, and giant ass water balloon. Those are just a few examples, but I really like this addition. It's a creative gimmick that expands on level possibilities, kinda like how Planet Robobot did with the robot suits. All this is solid quality stuff, but my main nitpick with it all really is just, to me, it seems like the transition to 3D for Kirby didn't take into account the game speed itself. I should stress though, Kirby isn't a series known for speedy gameplay, but a lot of the times the games can be pretty high octane for lack of a better term. Unfortunately, I think this is where Forgotten Land fumbles the most, as they cut back on a lot of inputs for abilities, removing a sense of flow I thought was really fun. I do admit this is ultimately a nitpick, but I honestly did get a little bored sometimes, as I was craving a hint of fast-paced action, but it's basically non-existent here, and this game primarily only focuses on exploration for those Waddle Dees, which I'll say again was well designed, but I don't know, I was definitely disappointed a little. I mean, in addition to all that, there is also a pretty low amount of copy abilities in this game, only reaching 12, which is the lowest the mainline series has seen yet, aside from Kirby 64, but that game had copy ability combinations to make up for it. This game instead has an upgrade system which, to give credit, is fun to take advantage of and learn what new attacks you can do each time, but I don't think the trade-off was worth it for having less abilities overall. I do understand though, it's the first ever 3D mainline Kirby game, so it's not going to be easy to adapt a bunch of abilities to 3D first try, but all that really means is the next 3D Kirby game is going to be way better in this regard. Which is exciting, but as for this game, I do truly think that is the biggest issue here. It's just too slow sometimes. Aside from that though, I do think this game is a huge leap forward for this series. Crazy how it's been 29 years and only now we have gotten a true 3D Kirby, and I'm glad we have a really good game to expand upon. The future is looking bright for this franchise. Portal 2 is a game that really needs no introduction. It's among the best the puzzle genre has to offer, and really everyone knows that, and I'm kinda surprised it took me this long to actually fully complete it. The gameplay and concept of Portal has yet to be matched within this genre in my opinion, and there is still truly no game quite like this series, and Portal 2 itself is just a perfect sequel in every conceivable way. The first game was great, but way too short, and was painfully obvious that a sequel had to be made to expand upon its concept. And it felt like Portal 1 was only scratching the minimum amount of possibilities with portals. And it's that aspect that pretty much assured Portal 2's success right from the bat. This formula is just ingenious, and this sequel very much took advantage of the countless ideas I bet the developers had while developing the first game. Portal 2 manages to be tougher, longer, funnier, and even more engaging than the first in pretty much every way. It makes the original seem like a tech demo in comparison. There are now laser cubes, launchers, bridges, magnetic fields, special group that affect your speed and jump height. It's amazing just how many new ideas they crammed into this game without all feeling too overwhelming each and every time either. Even the characters have much more focus this time too. GLaDOS is just as entertaining as before, but now there is a new chemistry between everyone in the form of Wheatley, a bumbling British robot core who is basically just the funniest character ever.
I just looked down. I do not recommend it. I've just done it again.
In addition to the characters being more involved, the story itself takes you on many rides as you work with Wheatley to escape Aperture Science, but right as you put him in control, he overthrows you and sends you down into the depths of Aperture's past. Only for you to eventually find a potato version of GLaDOS who just ends up chilling with you on your portal gun for the rest of the climb back up. It's so ridiculous, but it's incredibly enjoyable at the same time. Then on top of all of that, there's the co-op campaign, which is literally on its own just bigger than the first game, and now you get to solve puzzles with 4 portals while also doing a little bit of trolling. But I mean, at this point, you've heard all this before. It's Portal 2. If you haven't played the game to know all this already, then you've heard someone else sing the same praises before. This game's iconic status speaks for itself. There isn't even much else I could even say about the game for an entry in a countdown like this. I don't even think the game has any significant flaws, or many at all. I suppose the only reason why a game as good as this isn't number 1 on my list, despite how much I praised it already, probably is because I'm usually not big on the puzzle genre. It's just not my first choice in the type of game I usually feel like playing. But to me, that is why I believe is a true testament of this game's quality. I barely dabble in this genre, yet I love this game all the way through, and I'd play it through again and again in the future. Anyone, no matter your gaming preferences, can enjoy this masterpiece. Another series of games I played this year was Pokemon. I had played Orange, X and Y, and the Gen 1 remakes before, but I decided to actually go and play the rest this year, so I now have this fresh perspective for the whole series, and it's with this genius intellect I claim that Black and White 2 is the best in the franchise pretty easily. To clarify, I think the original Black and White are the second best games, it's just that the sequels improves on almost every aspect on top of adding a bunch of new content to an already extensive game. Despite that, I want to talk about what makes the original Black and White so good before touching on what Black and White 2 did to improve an already outstanding experience. Black and White are a part of the 5th generation of Pokemon released in 2010. So at this point, the series has been running for 14 years, so it was already pretty well established in how a game in this franchise is going to end up playing out. The main series games never usually try anything too crazy to shake up the formula that's been working since 1996, though as each generation releases, there are always small advancements in gameplay mechanics each time to keep things exciting for longtime fans. However, I would argue that Black and White introduced the least amount of new mechanics throughout the entire mainline series, including up to today. These games are very derivative. The thing is though, I believe this is part in Black and White's biggest strength. They didn't introduce anything wacky or some tacked on new gimmick. They had given full focus to perfecting the formula above all else. The first plus side of this approach is that these games introduced the most new Pokemon ever at 155, and that number has still yet to be beat even today. Most of the Pokemon this generation are pretty much just parodies of Gen 1 Pokemon, but despite that, I would say this game still has one of the best regional decks in the whole series. They were so confident in their new Pokemon that the original Black and White had you only encounter newly created Pokemon until the post-game. I gotta give some highlights to some sick designs in particular. Superior, Golurk, Chandelier, Seismitoad, Crocodile, Cofagrigus, Haxorus, and of course quite possibly the finest legendary box duo, Zekrom and Reshiram. So yeah, you could say I think they nailed it when regards to the actual Pokemon designs this generation, which is arguably the most important part. But that's obviously not all that goes into a Pokemon game, and fortunately Black and White's momentum simply does not stop at new designs. The region this time around is Unova, and up until now, regions were well designed and fun for sure, but they all kinda lacked a visual identity between each other. The reason for this is likely because they were all based on regions in Japan, but in this game, the basis is now America, giving the region a much stronger visual theme with big cities, tons of bridges, parks, suburban areas, and really just everything gives off a different yet more impactful vibe than before. I think it's fair to critique that the Unova region does end up feeling more linear than previous games, but if you can look past that, then there's a lot to appreciate here. Even the story in this game is miles ahead of everything prior, with the question being, is it even morally okay to be using Pokemon for battles, and if trainers and Pokemon should be separated for the greater happiness of everyone. Previous games pretty much always had a world domination kind of plan, but this game's story steps away from those high stakes, instead choosing to focus on the personal connections in which the whole series is based on with complex characters that drive this new narrative. I'm not going to argue and say it's a masterpiece of storytelling or anything, but it's interesting nonetheless, and I don't think any other game before or since has come close to making me care about as many characters or the story itself as this game did. I mentioned before that the gameplay itself didn't receive any mechanical additions, which up until this point was unheard of for this franchise. However, what did get the focus this time for battles was the presentation. I think the footage speaks for itself for this part, but the visuals and animation for Black and White are second to none in this whole franchise. This sprite quality is just phenomenal. Not just for the execution of transferring the designs onto the DS, but every Pokemon is now animated in battle with a ton of personality, which even the 3D games have yet to match. Couple that with a much faster battle speed than before, slick menus and sound design, and you got yourself the peak of Pokemon battle systems right here. Even the music is dynamic in these battles for the only time ever. If you have low health, a cool remix of the original annoying beeping sound starts to play. It's so good, it actually makes me want to be low health sometimes. But yeah, there's even more of this, like how the last Pokemon a gym leader sends out plays a triumphant theme for you, or how depending on the season you play the game and you get altered route music as well. It's so crazy to me. When it comes to all the little aspects that make up a Pokemon game, Black and White just does it all the best. The music, battles, story, characters, towns, and everything in between, Black and White just strikingly feels so polished across the whole board. Then on top of all of that, 2 years after the original Black and White released, the full-on sequels as mentioned previously come out, Black 2 and White 2. These sequel games really do live up to the name. It's 2 years later, old characters have progressed, the region is bigger, and there's a brand new story and adventure to partake in. It's just so good, I don't know how else I can describe it. There's so much to these games, it amazes me how future installments just missed the mark on too many little things when Black and White 2 just hit everything right. Nothing is undercooked here. And that all kind of brings me back to what I talked about at the beginning of this. Black and White are very derivative, but it's okay in the same kind of way Mario Galaxy 2 feels in relation to the first Galaxy game, for example. They may not have added a whole lot new, but it's with this experience built up over the years that once they had gotten down all the core mechanics from previous previous installments, Black and White is able to flourish with all the focus now on perfecting what Game Freak started. Black and White and its sequels remain today as the gold standard in my opinion for a Pokemon game, and its impact looks like it's gonna last for years to come. Sonic Frontiers seemed like it was 100% set up to be another blemish onto Sonic's reputation. I mean, the footage IGN showed in June wasn't exactly exciting or promising actually at all. Even months later when we got new footage, it just seemed like this idea of an open world Sonic was just not gonna work. I know I sure as hell was skeptical, and up until release I wasn't convinced that this game would be at least good. But then the game came out, and truthfully, I haven't been happier to be proven wrong before in a very long time. It truly shocked me. Everything actually made sense in this game. It was pretty much everything I had hoped, but never actually expected out of a modern Sonic game release. To start at the most important part, the gameplay loop that makes up your entire 18+ hour adventure is actually fairly simple, yet strongly effective. Each island has its own memory token, which is tied to each of Sonic's friends, and you'll need an X amount of tokens each time you interact with them to progress the story on each island. Memory tokens themselves are obtained through exploration of the 4 main islands. Literally by just accomplishing any bite-sized platforming challenge each island is littered with all over can get you a token. Then in between getting tokens are these minigames you can find and play to expand your map screen, and by doing that you can locate cyberspace portals and chaos emeralds. Every island is structured like this, and with how often you're doing everything I just mentioned, there's rarely a dull moment. Action is constantly happening, and surprisingly it never becomes too mind-numbing or repetitive, even through the unusually long length for a Sonic game. What helps break up the action the most, I believe, is the previously mentioned cyberspace portals. These are more traditional Boost-esque Sonic levels as opposed to the open zone gameplay of the main islands. Anyway, the rewards for beating these are vault keys, which you use to obtain chaos emeralds when you find them in the overworld. Then in cyberspace itself, there's 4 objectives tasking you to beat it under a certain time, get all red star rings, beat it with a certain number of rings, etc. Beating these objectives can get you an extra vault key each, giving you more flexibility on what cyberspace levels you don't feel like playing. Cyberspace though as a whole is probably the most underwhelming part about the game still, but it is very satisfying to fill out all objectives on a first try run of a stage, so I did still end up enjoying them a bit beyond the value of their existence serving for the gameplay loop. So yeah, the core gameplay of Frontiers is actually extremely solid and surprisingly addicting too. It's always fun, for example, to go from one platforming challenge, then once you launch out of a dash ring you continue that momentum and then land onto a different platforming challenge nearby and get even more memory tokens back to back. There's also combat in this game. Usually when Sonic tries this sort of thing, it's typically trash, but I think it's actually okay here. It's not very deep or anything. You only have a handful of skills and a basic square button combo, but it's fun to string special attacks together to kill stuff. And if you don't feel like engaging with the combat much, you can skip most of the enemies, as all they really do is give you XP, which isn't all that important since you're usually capable enough without needing every skill in the game. There are these Guardians which drop portal gears that are used to enter cyberspace, but they are usually cool because each of them have their own gimmicks to force you to fight them all differently. The only other thing I'd like to mention in regards to gameplay that I don't really know where else to put is this tech called the homing dash that lets you basically just fly in cyberspace stages. It's pretty much just an exploit of how the homing attack works, but it also got officially acknowledged recently despite being definitely unintended. I wanted to bring it up though since it's a really cool technique that makes replaying and speedrunning cyberspace stages really fun, even if on their own the stages are just okay. Moving on though. The story and writing in this game is honestly, actually, finally good. This past over a decade has been quite disappointing to say the least in the writing department, but finally, not every character is obnoxious and we have some continuity, which is nice to see for a franchise with so much history behind it. The plot itself is pretty simple, so I'm not going to go too deep into it, but what really caught my interest was the characters and how they developed this time. Sonic's friends kind of go through their own self-improvement arc in this game to gain more independence or life skills that are generally fueled by callbacks to past games, which for a long time was extremely rare you'd get any sort of acknowledgement of past events, but now it finally feels like all these stories and characters they had been building up over the years since the jump to 3D reached a payoff in this game's narrative. And it's with this new writing direction, I'm really happy that I feel like I can look forward to the next game's story and writing without worrying about stupid one-note personalities and unfunny jokes from these characters that I know can be better from games decades past. Alright, okay, now all that stuff's good and all, but the absolute most surreal moment I had ever felt playing a game in this entire franchise was playing that first boss. Holy balls. I'm not gonna try to sound hyperbole here, but my expectations were absolutely annihilated when I started the fight against Gigantua Supersonic, and that theme song started playing as I was beating the shit out of this colossal titan. Dude, the thrill of emotion that blew over me was something I'd never experienced in a Sonic game before. It actually blew my mind. It's not even the most challenging boss ever, or the most visually climactic. I mean, it's just the first bloody boss of the whole game. But this moment solidified the thought of, wow, Sonic is finally actually cool again. Even after beating this boss, all I could think about going into the next island was that I just needed to play the next boss right now to see how they followed that up, and they somehow did one-up themselves with the Wyvern fight. Like, bro, I can't overstate this. These bosses were the highlights of the game for me, and immediately jump to mind when I think of Frontiers now. I realize I'm coming across as a crazed fan saying all this, but I'm so glad this game time and time again subverted my expectations for a franchise practically drowned in negativity. It just made me so happy. And that aspect is a strong reason why Sonic Frontiers is my #1 favorite game I played this year. This game is far from perfect. Cyberspace could have been better, and the game could have still used a little bit more polish here and there, but it still ended up being everything I dreamed this series could be. Thanks for watching.
And don't forget to subscribe to the series.
No!